Welcome. We're glad to have you. We love doing our collaboration with Porchlight Book Company for these wonderful events. Today is, on the Boswell side of things, day 4,946 that we've been in business. Of course, Sally is our managing director of Porchlight Book Company, and we are always glad to work with her. She does wonderful conversations, and tonight she's going to be interviewing Kieran Setiya, whose book Life is Hard. I'll hold it up again. We have a staff rec for. I wanted to tell you that our bookseller, Tim, says Setiya's framework is one I find extremely helpful in my own battle to want this life. Setiya makes it interesting and easy to read. This is a man that understands me and has a voice that I've needed. Perhaps he can help you too. So with that spirit, I will disappear, turn it over to Sally for some introducing. Sally, Kieran, welcome.
Thank you. And greetings to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Kieran Setiya, and I'm Sally Haldorson, Managing Director of Porchlight Book Company, as Chris mentioned. Kieran is a professor of philosophy at MIT and author of Midlife, a Philosophical Guide. His writing has appeared in such publications as the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, the London Review of Books, and the New York Times. His new book is Life is Hard, How Philosophy Can Help Us Find Our Way. And I'd like to further introduce him by reading this line from one of the later chapters that I think will center us for this conversation. Quote, "Wonder and worry, anxiety and awe, these feelings are what led me to philosophy." End quote. And isn't that our own grappling with wonder and worry, anxiety and awe, the gifts and burdens of being human, what leads us to a book like this one, in which we are offered not only compassion and consolation, but also companionship as we navigate a life that, as we well know, and Professor Setiya affirms here, is inevitably and inexorably hard, but also worth living well. Welcome, and thank you for being here, and thank you for this gift of a book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So we have lots of material to cover as I knock everything down. We're so happy to have all our participants here, and hopefully what we will be able to communicate to them while we have this conversation is just why this book is so right for our times. And I think I would want to start out in a what can, I suppose, could be a very superficial way, and yet I think has a lot of significance. Your subtitle reads, "How Philosophy Can Help Us Find Our Way." And I think this is key for understanding the aim of this book. When one is lost, and we can define lost in a couple different ways, the easy one, when we're unsure of how to get to our destination. But in context of this book, I would say it's a slightly more nuanced. When something difficult happens, we have to course correct or change our destination. So tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book and how you see readers putting this book to use as they navigate hardship in their lives.
I started writing it before the pandemic, so it is in its way marked by the pandemic. Before the pandemic, I wanted to write a book about the good life, about how to think philosophically, about how to live well, that was really honest, that really kept touch with the way in which life is hard. And some of this we may get to came out of my own experience with chronic pain. And I wanted to write about that experience, but I didn't want to write a whole book about my own experience with chronic pain. I wanted to treat it as a case study of one kind of hardship that led its way into a kind of wider panorama of difficulties, loneliness, grief, failure, injustice. Then the pandemic hit, and many of those things came to take on an extra urgency. People's loneliness, people's grief during the pandemic were palpable. And I was also, I wasn't locked in a room, but I spent a lot of time in my study at my computer writing. The first few months of the pandemic, I was in a daze. I could barely read. I was just, like many people, totally disoriented. I got over that after a few months, and then spent the rest of the pandemic writing it. And what I hope is that the subtitle balances the title. So it's a book that acknowledges that life is hard, but it's not a depressing book. I hope it's not a bleak book. It's a book that has both, I think, some humor, but also a mixture of advice and acknowledgement. A very big part of what I found helpful in my own difficulties was just accepting what was going on and sitting with it, and not too quickly trying to come up with glib advice. So I think of this as a book that is, it's sort of almost philosophical self-help. The only thing I resist is that sometimes when people talk about self-help, they have in mind something superficial, that there's quick tips and they're all about your happiness. And I think, no, it's not quick. And it's not just about your happiness. It's about your relationships to other people and to society. But I hope the book on each of the topics it addresses has something useful to say to people who are grappling with the difficulties we all grapple with.
It's funny, I did make a note in one of my questions about, it seems that self-help is not anathema to you, which is not always the case for, I've been selling business and personal development books for 20, 25 years, and there's always been a tension between self-help and what a more loftier intention of the author might be. And I think there's something very refreshing about the mixture of philosophy, which can be an intimidating subject to some, and self-help, which can be a sort of downgraded version of literary endeavor to others. So how did you bring those two things together? Obviously from your deep experience in philosophy, and yet with this intention to make it accessible.
I suppose there's two parts to, it's a great question. I think there's sort of two sides to it. One is substance and the other is style. I mean, on the substance, I think one of the key ideas of the book is that we have to distinguish just feeling happy from actually living a good life. So you could feel happy and be completely oblivious to what's going on around you, not really know what's happening in the lives of your friends, not really understand what's happening in your own life, but you feel great. And if that's your goal, and that's the goal of self-help, then no, I don't want to write self-help, because I think what we really should be aiming for is a kind of living well that involves being in touch with reality. So one way to bridge the gap is to say, if self-help is really about living well, living a good life, which means being in touch with the world, being in touch with other people, then the difference between that and what philosophy traditionally, moral philosophy at least traditionally has been, is very blurry. I mean, really, the ancient ambition of moral philosophy was not just to study what it was to live a good life, but to help people live better lives. I think in terms of style, maybe the style substance thing is too crude. I mean, because in a way, one of the other ideas that I have is that people sometimes think of philosophy as a bunch of abstract theories or complicated arguments. And there is some of that in philosophy. But a lot of what we do when we're reflecting on how to live is really just trying to describe with the right concepts what we're actually going through and use those descriptions to orient us. And I think of that as part of a philosophical task, but it's also a task that it borders on memoir and fiction and other kinds of creative writing. And I think that also helps to bridge the gap between philosophy and as an academic discipline and philosophy aimed at people who are not professional philosophers or in grad school or studying this as students, because describing things in ways that help to orient people is already a task that forces you to think about communication and audience and clarity in a way that, philosophers, when they're addressing each other, don't need to so much.
That's a really good point. That I think one of the things that recommends this book and how well it reads is the fact that there are many instances where you bring in poets, writers, other very tangible sort of touch points for us, where you take that philosophical argument or concept and ground it in a way that those of us who aren't practiced in that kind of thought process can really also understand. And of course, there's also your story, and there are stories of other people that you have included. I'm going to back up one step here. You mentioned the word happiness, and I think that this is always an interesting topic, particularly in our culture. And one of the key arguments that you make through, like, with the intention of the book, I think, is that a good life is not the same as an ideal life. And you write, this is a quote, to live well in the sense that animates this book is to cope with the ways in which life is hard while finding enough in one's life worth wanting. And in a society that highly values happiness, getting, if that's one way we want to look at it in terms of material or noteworthy ambitions or achievements, that kind of thing, as a primary indicator of a good life, then how do we resist this idealism and yet still keep wanting? And because you use that word very specifically, I think that you find enough in one's life worth wanting, and yet how that tension between wanting and getting.
Yeah, so to some extent, the ultimate answer to those kinds of questions would lie in politics and sort of how society is structured to make us have the desires we have, and often consumerist desires for more. I mean, thinking about this more internally to our own lives, I think part of what's helpful is to recognize that in a way you can't have it all. So that there's a kind of fantasy of a life lacking in nothing. And this is an idea that goes back to ancient philosophers like Aristotle, who think that in a really good life, that there couldn't be anything going wrong. If you have a really good life, there couldn't be omissions in that. Whereas I think if you look around you and think about people, say, not necessarily famous people you know who are having pretty good lives, you think, oh, they're doing well. It's easy if you take someone who's doing well to come up with a huge list of things that they don't have, and that maybe they don't have an ear for music, or maybe they can't paint, or maybe they don't have kids, or maybe they do have kids and don't have the leisure time of people who do have kids. And so I think a recognition of the way in which our desire for more and a desire for everything is inevitably going to be frustrated helps us realize this is unrealistic. It's not even a possible kind of, the ideal is not attainable. Now, then there's a question, well, how much is enough? And I think that's a harder and more personal question of what is sort of enough in one's life that's good to give one a sense that one's life is meaningful. And it's hard. I don't think there's a formula for that, but the answer can't be, I think, list all of the things that will be really great and attempt to check them all off, and if you do, you win, and if you don't, you lose. That way of thinking about life is one that is, when the more you push on it, the more you realize it just isn't viable. And its unviability is not purely a function of social factors. There's just no world, I think, in which everything we want is going to be attainable. And I mean, a final thing to say about that is, it's not a regrettable fact, really. I mean, if you imagine what your life would have to be like for there to be nothing you are really missing, the only way that could happen is if you're sufficiently blinkered to all the wonderful things in the world that you just don't really care about most of them, and no one really wants that. So I think appreciating that there's more in the world that's good that you can have is a sign of kind of emotional health, really.
There are about 4 different directions I can go in from your answer, and but I'm going to stick in the book and go into your first chapter, which is titled Infirmity. And I think this is a good segue into that, because as you were saying, that a good life versus an ideal life, if we accept the fact that there are constraints on our lives anyway, for what, as you say, if you don't have an ear for music, you may have to accept the fact that you will never be a maker of music, or you will never be a professional singer, or whatever, or even maybe you shouldn't sing in your house because you'll alienate everybody in it. Whatever that scenario is, in a sort of lighthearted kind of way. But we make these kinds of deals with ourselves all the time, right? Like, I will never be a marathon runner. I am okay with that. And am I? Maybe I am. But then you move into Infirmity, where we're talking about a much heavier version of the constraints placed on a person. And that chapter has both, you address disability and you also address illness and pain and chronic pain, and how the ways that our bodies are limited creates constraints for us, but that is not by default disenabling us from having a good life. Can you talk a little bit about what you cover in that chapter? And I think this is a pretty weighty subject for a lot of people to be able to get around the idea of these sort of limitations, and yet still being able to find something in life worth wanting.
So I think you're right that there's a very close connection between what I was just saying about the inevitable limitations of any life, the inevitable omissions of any life, and the discussion of disability in that chapter. So I pick up on two things. One is a kind of idea that has been very influential as a result of disability activists pushing it, which is the idea that if it weren't for poor accommodations, physical disability, at least when it's localized, say being blind or deaf or having mobility issues, by itself wouldn't necessarily make life worse, which can be a puzzling idea, because for many people, the idea of being disabled in one of those ways seems like a terrible thing to happen. But in fact, the other point is that the social science bears this out, that when social scientists study the levels of life satisfaction of people who have those kinds of localized physical disabilities, they find that to a surprising degree, becoming disabled is tough, and then people bounce back, and their levels of life satisfaction are not really significantly lower than those of physically able-bodied people. So what's going on there? How do we make sense of that? And I think the answer is, once you recognize that there's too many good things in life for a good life to encompass them all, which is something we all confront, you can think of the situation of someone who, say, it has mobility issues or is blind as just an extreme version of that. It's in certain ways more extreme, but what's happened is there are certain good things that are unavailable. And if those are good things you're really attached to, this could be very, very difficult. But in principle, the idea that there's certain good things in the world you're not going to have access to, and you have, but there's all these other good things sufficient to make a good life. That's just a kind of extreme version of the situation that we all find ourselves in all of the time. Now, that's not to make light of the plight of people with physical disabilities. And partly, I think, the way in which that's the case is underlined when the activists say, but for poor accommodations. Because if a localized physical disability prevents you from not just, seeing things because you're blind, but also getting around, getting an education, getting a job, appreciating, interacting with other people. If it has all those knock-on effects, it is going to be really devastating. So I think the idea that the activists are pushing is, the more you localize the limitations, the more they'll just be an extreme version of limitations that we all face. And so there is room for a kind of world in which there are adequate accommodations for people with physical disabilities to be one in which, as the evidence, the data suggests, they can live lives, people with physical disabilities can live lives that are not appreciably worse than the lives of the rest of us, and sometimes better.
And I think, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think while there's a certain amount of maybe discomfort in our acceptance of that, because we have built up so many fears around limitations, right? And I think that some of that's conditioned because we know that the world is not accessible to a lot of people, or make it easy for people to have bodies that are not typical. But I think, as you point out in the book, and we have learned from a lot of more recent studies, is that that when we talk about disability, we're also talking about aging. We're also talking about the human condition, right? Because we are in bodies that are either susceptible to pain, or susceptible to impact of whatever variety and will inevitably age. And so how do you then take that same significance beyond the rarer cases of disability into it's pretty much what everybody's going to face at some point if you're lucky enough to live to be of an older age.
Yeah, no, exactly. And this is there's another slogan coined by disability activists was or at least the phrase that the temporarily able-bodied for people like me, because if you're lucky enough to make it into older age, you're virtually inevitably going to lose certain kinds of physical abilities that you have when you're in the prime of life. And even I'm only in my 40s, but there are many things I can't do now that I could do 20 years ago. So yeah, I do think there's a part of it is that we have false expectations. So my previous book was called Midlife: A Philosophical Guide, and was about having a kind of midlife crisis. But one thing that the social science there suggests is that when you look at people's life satisfaction by age, it has a kind of gentle U shape. So starts out high in youth, flattens out in your 40s. That's the worst. And then it comes up again in your older age for men and women and around the world. And what's going on there? It's much less well understood why this is happening. But one of the most common, most sort of well-supported hypotheses is that it has to do with expectations, that people expect aging to be worse than it. They expect middle age to be better than it is, and then they're disappointed. But then they expect aging to be worse than it is. And so the part of the upward swing of this U curve is people thinking, actually, I can find all kinds of things to make life worth living, even though I can't anymore, play basketball the way I could 20 years ago. And so I think it is another instance of this same phenomenon. I think you're right.
And I think this is a takeaway that we can, pull through the book, or thread that we can pull through the book, is that this is a matter of perspective. It's a matter of how we look at a situation. And you talk very openly in the book, not only of your mother's approaching Alzheimer's, as well as your own chronic pain, in those two examples, in terms of pain and sort of how we face the loss of ability. And so you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you didn't really want to write a whole book about your own chronic pain, but you do include it in a fairly limited amount, I think, within the book. But it does clearly shape your perspective and the work that you're doing in finding the good things in a good way of living. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think chronic pain and chronic conditions are so common now that people are really looking for ways that they can survive them and keep living well.
Yeah, so for me, this was definitely the way into the orientation of the book. And I think once you're dealing, as many people are, with some degree of chronic pain, the thought, well, happiness and feeling good is one thing, but there has to be more to life, becomes a kind of existential issue. The thought is, I'm not going to feel great, but there's all kinds of ways in which my life could be good. I could be doing good things. I could be having good relationships. So you're sort of put in that frame of mind. I mean, the other part for me was, if I was going to sort of give in the Hollywood version of how I came to write the book, the key scene would be at the point where, so I have chronic pelvic pain. It took a long time to, quote, diagnose it, but the diagnosis, like many chronic conditions, involves naming the symptom and saying, good luck with that. Like if there's no reliable treatment. But I remember at some point, the point where I really acknowledged this is not going away, my first response was to be really angry. And I remember a moment of sitting in a room watching people walk by, strangers walk by, feeling bitterly envious and thinking, you don't know how great you have it to be pain-free.
Right.
And then there was a beat, and I thought, I have no idea what's going on with those people. They have no idea what's going on with me and what I'm thinking right now and what I'm experiencing. They could be going through all kinds of things, needn't be physical pain, all kinds of adversity. And I think that was a moment of thinking, one of the ways in which when you're dealing with hardship in life, I think you oscillate between a kind of absorption in your own difficulties, and moments in which it is a kind of lever towards a kind of compassion for other people, a sense of other people's difficulties. And I think one thing we can do to cope with not just chronic pain, but any kind of difficulties we're going through, is seize on those moments that expand our sense of the world and other people, rather than having us shrink in. And that's one thing that I think was behind writing the book. I mean, in terms of chronic pain in particular, the way I approach it is through the kind of philosophical methodology called phenomenology, where it's about the study of lived experience, like trying to really understand why it's bad. And I think there's something, for me, this was very interesting in that you might think, well, pain's bad,
Right.
end of story. Like, what is there to say? But actually, there's a lot to say about why pain is bad. I mean, that goes beyond just it doesn't feel good. So part of it, I think, has to do with the way in which we normally experience our bodies as sort of transparent. We just experience the world through them, and we don't really think about our bodies. When you start to focus on your body, it's like getting the yips in baseball. You suddenly, you're like, I can't, how do I throw a ball? And I think one of the problems with chronic pain, or really any pain, is that it brings the body into focus. So this medium that should be transparent becomes cloudy, and it's very hard to engage with other people or the world. I think that's understanding that helped me to see why it wasn't just this is bad, but that it was getting in the way of appreciating good things in my life. And then the other way in which I think reflecting on the experience helped was that reflecting on the temporality of chronic pain, any extended pain, a huge part of why it's difficult is that it isn't experienced as just a series of isolated incidents, isolated moments. There's so much anxiety and difficulty projecting into the future, the sense of fear about the future. If you could, so people may know the sitcom Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. So she's trapped in a bunker for 15 years, and her mantra is, you can stand anything for 10 seconds. Now, I'm not saying you can stand anything, and I feel like 10 seconds is a little unambitious. Let's go a bit longer. But I do think if it weren't for the anticipation, it just wouldn't be so bad. You can have a pretty good day while in some degree of pain, just doing other stuff. And it is just one day after another. So I think recognizing that helped me to understand why the advice to just focus on the present has a kind of deep philosophical foundation. It has to do with the way in which we experience our own bodies and the way in which we experience pain, and the fact that these sort of this sense of the future and sense of the past being threatening is such a huge part of why it's difficult. And I think that applies not just to my experience of pain, but to a lot of people's experience of difficulties like it.
Yeah. My husband has a chronic pain issue with his eyes, and so we experience a lot of similar sort of ebbs and flows, and I think that one of the things that hyper awareness of a body part, I think, ends up sort of changing our wiring over time, because one of the things that we assume, especially as we're younger, is that we can sort of be oblivious about our bodies, right? And it's all about learning and developing our minds and our intelligence. And I know that I have been one of these people who sort of grew up and disassociated from being a physical person and just focused on being a mental person. And you just assume these things are going to be working. And then when your body starts to not work, or in your denial about it not working, which is probably more my case, that hyper sensitivity to the body is really shocking. And I think, we can there's a lot of mortality issues and all of that kind of stuff, and vulnerability issues there. But one of the lines that you wrote that I noted was, quote, a non-ideal approach to life, which is what we've been talking about, the non-ideal, living a good life, does not wish these facts away, leaving the body behind. Instead, it asks how we should live with the malfunctioning bodies we have. And I think that like, you have already talked about acceptance as being part of how we deal with these extra challenges that we end up developing over time or instantaneously in some situations. But that learning to live with is such a critical part of it. But I also think something that you just said that I want to move into is the connectedness or the loneliness that can come from something like chronic pain, right? And you talk about, you bring a number of literary authors into this book, as we've mentioned, but it particularly in this chapter, you bring Virginia Woolf into this chapter and Hilary Mantel, and both of whom experienced chronic pain, but had different perspectives on how to express that experience in a way to make it understandable. And you acknowledge that there is the quote, unshareability of pain, which divides us from one another. But you also choose to write about your own pain here, because perhaps as you write, quote, suffering can be a source of solidarity. So those two, I think that's a good example, first of all, in how you're structuring each of your chapters, where while there is advice and there is a methodology here, you're also looking at many facets of the issue. You're not just saying that there is one pat answer to how we are supposed to experience pain. And here we have both the unshareability and we have that it can be a source of solidarity. So how do we make sense of that?
I think that, so there is this phenomenon that I think this is something I'm still thinking through for myself. So one reason to write about my experience of chronic pelvic pain was to destigmatize a condition that isn't much talked about, can be kind of, it's not the most dignified form of illness to have pelvic pain all the time. So, and to think, well, this is a way of reaching out to other people who have this condition, or who are the many people who have chronic pain, and saying, especially these invisible forms where you may not have talked to anyone about it, you may not have shared it, you may feel very isolated by it, and say, I'm with you. Like I also, you're seen, and this is something you can talk about. There's also a phenomenon that I don't fully understand myself, which is that even before, even just the process of writing about it, even before anyone else read it, I felt there was something really therapeutic about that. And I can't quite describe why, but it had something even before it actually was shared with anyone, something about the externalizing it and putting it into words and making it concrete was helpful. It reminds me of this, when my kid was younger, when they would get really obsessed with something that was really bothering them. We had this thing where we would say, write it down on a scrap of paper, crumple it up and throw it in the trash. And I'm not saying it always worked, but this reminded me of that, the sense that somehow this is now an objective fact that's out there. So I do think that although you can't literally, no one can sort of take your pain on for you. No one you can't, however much you might want to with someone you love, you might want to just say, I wish I could just have their pain for them just for a while, like just to give them a break. Although you can't do that, something about sharing it in language is, I think, profoundly consoling, even beyond saying, and here's some advice about what to do about it, or here's a way to reframe it that will make it better. Just the sheer mutual recognition, the acknowledgement there is, I think, a very important part of coming to terms with difficulty. And yeah, that in a way, that's part of the strategy of, as you say, throughout the whole of the book, is to say, let's just first sit with this problem and try to describe like why loneliness is hard, or what's going on in grief. Because even just getting your head around it can help to make you feel like I'm not losing my mind here. This is really happening, and it really is hard, and this is why it's hard. Yeah.
Right. And not just being reactive, which I think is part of our instinct. I think your chapter on loneliness then also expands into, our need as social beings to be in connection with one another. And I think this is a really pertinent chapter for our times now, because we are really trying to make sense of what it meant to be isolated from one another in COVID, what it means to be communicating and connecting digitally as opposed to in person, but then also being in person and having some resistance to that and thinking, well, there were things that we gained positively from not having to be in person, like not having to go to that reunion or not having to go to meetings all the time. And yet you caution in the chapter that has a lot of, obviously a lot more material in it, but you caution that loneliness is self-perpetuating. And it is a function of agency to commit to one or two things that will prevent us from sort of being absorbed by loneliness. Can you talk about that a little bit and articulate it better than I just did?
No, but that's exactly right. That I think what happened, it's partly that one's outwardness sort of atrophies. And I think probably people have a sense of this. You may be experiencing it to different degrees, but the sense that post lockdown, it's hard to interact with people again, or some of the skills of interaction that you might have thought were utterly ingrained can sort of fray surprisingly rapidly. And think, and you're right, there are certain conveniences of taking away, of not having to go into the office, but and the costs of that only become sort of more apparent later. I think and this is again something that both, I think the philosophy of loneliness and friendship and the social science both sort of converge on the idea that that once you're lonely, you have a sense of being not appreciated, not really recognized, that your value is not really in view. And of course, that makes it threatening to interact with people. It makes it feel frightening because no one seems to value you. And this interaction is therefore with someone who might rebuff you. It might be difficult. And I don't think there's a magic solution to that other than recognizing that even small interactions, small moments of connection are already going to scratch the itch that we feel when we're lonely. So, even just interacting with the barista and having a brief conversation in which someone acknowledges that you exist, it may seem very different from close friendship, and it is very different from close friendship, but it's really a difference of degree. There's sort of a continuum from just acknowledging someone's value to the kind of more profound acknowledgement of someone's value that comes with really intimate friendship. And again, that's something that I think once you think of friendship as just acknowledging someone's value, that would make sense. And again, it's something that the social science also suggests. So, there are tactics for doing this that involve things like giving yourself a script and just doing it, just saying, I'm going to go and ask someone a question. And they, when social psychologists do experiments in which they put people in this awkward circumstance where they have to go up to a stranger on a train and ask them a question and tell them something personal about themselves, people are like, I do not want to do that. And then when they do it, they're almost never rebuffed. And then they feel better afterwards. And that's not leading to, it's what's amazing about the social science is how significantly that can sort of overcome loneliness, even though it's just this superficial brief interaction. It's not a deep connection. And that's one of the reasons why I worry about the kind of pandemic changes in our lifestyle, because if those small interactions are just doing a lot to give us a sense that we're valued and we're connected and we're part of the human world, then if you take away all those small interactions, because now we're doing all the little things via, online, anonymously, then I think that will have much more substantial effects than we might realize.
I have a quote about this that I thought was really effective. We have a metaphysical need for one another. Our subjectivity is not self-sustaining. We cannot fully exist except in relation to other people. And I think that's what you're talking about here, that we need to sort of proverbially rub up against people in order to know we're here, right? To
Yeah.
find our edges and to help define ourselves.
No, exactly.
And we don't get that.
You're right. And you can see like what we're experiencing is not, is a milder version of things that you can see very sharply in extreme cases like solitary confinement, where people will literally talk about the sense that they don't really exist anymore, and that kind of they have a real kind of ontological sense that their being is precarious. Most of us are not in a situation that extreme, but we're experiencing that there's a kind of sense of unreality that came for many of us with the pandemic that is not unrelated to that.
So we're going to switch gears here quickly. We're going to make a quick switch so that we can spend some time with the next chapter. And if I were to try to convince someone to buy your book on one chapter alone, it would be your chapter on grief. And I think it's beautifully written and so full of compassion, but in it, you first dispel some myths about grief. You write, quote, according to a long tradition in Western philosophy, the answer is that grief is a pathology, a problem to be solved, but grief is not a mistake, and philosophy should not disown it, which is an incredibly powerful line, I think, especially for those of us who have or are experiencing grief. And that in and of itself is a balm to those of us who feel like we should get over it, or we feel like there's a set timeline, or there are 5 stages, or whatever sort of handy guide we're trying to follow in terms to get back to our normal lives. And yet then we feel tremendous guilt getting back to our normal lives. And one of the things that you introduced me to, and that I feel very that has benefited me in terms of my mindset is you say that if grief is inherently about the loss of something, then that loss remains, especially if the loss is the death of a loved one or a relationship, and it remains a loss. And thus grief is never over because that loss is never over, but our relationship with it and the person we lose changes. I'm going to quote you again here to help me out, help me introduce this to people. When grief is relational, as it almost always is, grieving well is working through the change that the relationship undergoes. Change that is, not end. And in another section, quote, to grieve well, one must navigate this dilemma, abandon the dead and be disloyal, or cling to them as they were and suffer. The way through, however hard, is to accept that one's relationship must change without conceding that it's over. And to me, this felt revelatory. And what I'm hoping that I captured through these short quotes is this idea that grief has a life cycle of its own, and it doesn't mean that, I guess, we're in control of that life cycle. It is going to expand out as long as we do. And that it's then okay for us to adapt to that sense of loss without ever needing to get over it.
Right. And I think, one thing that thinking of it in terms of the continuing relationship does is bring into view the possibility of positive ways of grieving. The thought,
right, yes.
But what will this relationship now be? Which seems like a weird question to ask in a way when someone has died, but nevertheless, you're going to have a relationship with them forever. The question is it going to be one in which you're just forever frustrated that it's not the way it was? Or is there a new way to relate to them? And then the question is, well, what ways of relating to them are possible for me, and what would do justice to them so far as I can in their absence? So trying to think about what you can do that honors the person who is gone and is a way of relating to them that would make sense of the importance they had in your life and the value of their life in itself. Those are all ways of sort of reframing what happens as a change that is almost always painful and complicated, but that it doesn't involve saying, well, that's over. And the change doesn't involve disloyalty. I think that people often in these sort of feel torn between the two extremes. As I said, there's a sort of dilemma of saying, well, to get over this would be in some way to betray the person who I've lost. And on the other hand, what's the alternative to that? And the alternative is to continue to have a relationship, but reshape it in ways that are sort of responsive to that loss. So, I mean, the story that comes to mind for me was, while I was writing this book, my father-in-law died of an apparent heart attack during the pandemic, and this was in the period of the pandemic where it was impossible to travel, basically. So my wife couldn't go to see him, and everything felt improvised, and that was very difficult. But on the other hand, the answer was sort of clear in a way, which was, okay, we've got to improvise this. What can you do to commemorate someone when you can't be there? And there were practical things like we had a Zoom memorial, but there were also a whole lot of things that she wanted to do and that we did in the days and weeks after he had died that involved watching college basketball because he loves college basketball, or buying a lottery ticket because he used to love gambling. And we would those are ways of saying that there's a kind of continuing presence that you have in my life that I think helped her to do something. I still think it's hard when you're not. I think the inability to just be physically there and to have the rituals you expected you would have is I think very hard.
I think it definitely is. And I think it's but the reframing of, I mean, I lost, my mother died when I was 12, so some 40 years ago. So she's been gone a long time, far longer than she was in my life. But even to frame that relationship and think, because I have a lot of memories of her and I've written a lot about her, and to just reframe that and think that I'm still having a relationship with her as opposed to I'm just experiencing a memory of her is, I think, a quite different way of coming at not having a person in your life, whether they have died or have left your life in a different kind of way. So I very much, I think that chapter is one that I would hope that everybody spends some time with. And another incredibly helpful and welcome chapter that I think would surprise people, so I just want to introduce it here, is your chapter on failure and failure as a hardship, and how first I was surprised to learn, because I've never thought about it, that identifying people as failures is a fairly new concept, as opposed to something failing, that a person can fail, and that is really tied to our society and capitalism and all the things. But you discuss how we often assume that a life that has a narrative arc equals a good life. And I found this to be really fascinating because there are, we have rags to riches stories. We have the hero's journey. We have all of these ways that we're taught that to get from here to there equals success. And then you're not a failure, and lives that sort of have more of a heartbeat kind of rhythm are less somehow focused and successful. So can you talk a little bit more about just this sort of surprising look at failure?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there's both the up and down and also the scattered, the sense of someone's life is just all over the place. They have all kinds of interests, but what are they really about? Yeah. And there's a kind of pressure to sort of tell the story of your life as if you're the protagonist of your own Hollywood movie. And there's got to be a quest, and there's got to be something you're going for, and sometimes that can work out, but one of the risks there is the more you define yourself by a single ambition or narrative arc, the more you're setting yourself up for a kind of failure that feels life-defining, the kind of failure that isn't just failing in a project, but makes you a failure or a loser. But also, even if you succeed, there's a way in which focusing on a narrative of what your life is is a way of just ignoring the richness of your own life, so ignoring the plurality of little things you've done and the little connections you've made that don't have to add up to one overarching narrative to be meaningful and valuable. And so I think there's a kind of embrace of the plurality and diversity of life that is both appropriate in itself, I mean, sort of recognizing reality in itself, but also protective of, protects one against the sense that any one thing can define us. And so I think that's something we can push back against. But as you said, the pushback can partly come from how we think about our own lives, like changing our own perspectives, but it also involves pushing back against social structures. So I think the idea that we're defined by certain projects and those are the ones that really matter isn't just something that we're inventing. You know, it comes from the idea that certain kinds of social status and, for instance, financial status are the defining project that tells you whether you're a success or a failure. And we can mentally push back against that, but ultimately, I think what we want to do and what we should want to do is to reshape society so that it doesn't, you know, that it has a, well, I was going to say a richer vision of what success and failure are like. But what I really want to say is we don't evaluate people as successes or failures at all. We go back to this pre-lapsarian state where you can fail in a project, but the idea that you are a failure just doesn't really make sense, that we don't think of people's lives as being measured on a single scale in a way that would allow us to say that at all.
That's, I think, something that touches everybody on the smallest scale to the largest. And I think it does connect to some of what you talk about later in the book about answering that sort of common, probably the question most philosophers get the most, which is, what is the meaning of life, right? You probably hear that in an elevator or in any kind of introduction. And it is in a chapter on absurdity, you address sort of like, what is the meaning of life? You address that question, and it harkens back to all the things that we've been talking about here about not idealism in place of actual appreciation for the things that we have and the things we're able to accomplish, and a lack of judgment on those things, and a lack of ranking what is valuable in life. And so in terms of this book in particular, if I throw back to you, so what is the meaning of life? How are you conveying that message here in this book?
So yeah, that's good. We're ending with the easiest question. What is the meaning of life? Yeah. I mean, the way I think we can make sense of this question is as really asking how we should feel about not just our own lives, whether we individuals have meaningful lives in all this, in this diversity of ways. But when we ask about the meaning of life or the meaning of human life, the question is something like, well, how should we feel about human existence as a whole? And I think that's a question that makes sense to ask. I mean, we do have feelings about, we look at how human history has gone and we feel dismayed at the injustice of the last 100, 200, 2,000 years. We think that so much terrible stuff has happened. Should I just think, I despair at humanity? But we also see moments of progress and moments of beauty, and we think, oh, maybe I should feel good about this. And I think the what we want when we want life to have a meaning is to be able to reach a settled view of that. And I think religions really, they do answer this question, because at least very often they give us a story about human life that tells us, here's how it all fits together, and this is how you can feel okay with it, how you can reconcile yourself to all the things that are terrible, because here's the larger narrative into which it fits. And if you're not religious, you don't have that larger narrative or assurance that there is a larger narrative. But that doesn't mean there isn't one. There really could be. It's just that whether there is a narrative on which, as it were, humanity bends the arc of history towards justice isn't guaranteed. It just depends on how the future goes. So we're in a situation where our sense of how to feel about human existence is dependent on how the future goes. And that's sort of dependent on us collectively. So in a way, the existentialists would say the meaning of your own life is up to you. And what I want to say is, well, really the meaning of human life as a whole is up to us collectively.
Right.
We really could make human life as a whole, if the arc of history bends the right way, something we can affirm, but we have to actually do it.
Right. And our contribution to that is what can reflect back that meaning.
Right. No, exactly. And it may be very small, but I think it's one of the most important things to hold on to is the distinction between nothing and small. That all of the big changes that make the world a better place are made up of lots and lots and lots of tiny changes. And so, if we didn't value the tiny changes and we just thought, forget it, the difference I'm going to make is so tiny, we would be throwing away something far more important than it may seem.
And I think that also then puts into perspective some of the hardships that we experience as individuals and where the light can be found amongst the darkness. And unfortunately, even though we could keep talking, this is the end of our hour. And I will say to all of our attendees, both thank you, but also you will get so much more from reading this book. And there are more chapters on injustice, and there's a chapter on hope, and there are all of these different ways that assist us in helping us think about this life we are living and how to live it well. And so I thank you for joining us. Thank you for being our featured author. And we hope to see you all at Porchlight and at Boswell, and with Kieran Setiya's book in your hand.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you.
And from Boswell, let me thank you both, Sally, Kieran. What a thoughtful, insightful conversation.